Kevin Holden-Ray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and for granting this urgent question. I'd like to ask the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy if he will make a statement on the Government's plans to bring forward an economic crime bill.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question, but as I'm sure he'll appreciate, I'm not going to speculate about the content of any future Queen's speech. That's the correct moment for the Government to be setting out its legislative agenda for the next parliamentary session. However, I can confirm that the Government remains committed to tackling economic crime, which is why my colleagues in the Home Office and the Treasury take the lead on this. In the recent years, we've taken a number of actions, including creating a new National Economic Crime Centre to coordinate the law enforcement response to economic crime, and establishing the Office for Professional Body AML Supervision to improve oversight of anti-money laundering compliance in the legal and accountancy sectors. We delivered the Criminal Finances Act 2017, which introduced new powers, including unexplained wealth orders and account freezing orders. We're determined to go further to crack down on dirty money, to protect our security and our prosperity. With the publication of the Fraud Strategy and Second Economic Crime Plan this year, we will further level up the response to crack down on these types of crimes. My department is playing its part. Bayes announced plans to reform Companies House in September 2020, and in 2021 we consulted on more detailed aspects of the reforms, and we will respond soon. Investment in new capabilities at Companies House is already underway, with £20 million being invested this financial year and a further £63 million announced at the spending review. The draft Registration of Overseas Entities Bill has undergone pre-legislative scrutiny. We're amending the bill in line with the committee's recommendations and in line with comments the Prime Minister made to this House just yesterday. We will introduce the bill and the broader reforms to Companies House when parliamentary time allows.
Good, Holden-Ray.
I'm grateful to the Minister for his response. As he knows, economic crime costs the people of this country £100 billion per annum, according to the National Crime Agency. The Government has repeatedly committed to legislate to give our agencies the tools they need to tackle this problem. It was there very concerning to hear from my noble friend Lord Agnew, who recently resigned from his role as Minister responsible for countering fraud, that a decision has been made to drop the economic crime bill from the legislation due in the next parliamentary session. This is not a notional white-collar offence. It affects real people in very tangible ways. Terrorists and drug dealers depend on it to launder and legitimise their money through UK banks, companies and properties. Up to 50% of monies flowing through Russian laundromats, often used for tax avoidance, stolen public funds and to launder monies derived from organised crime, flowed through UK shell companies. UK corporate structures were involved in arms deals which breached sanctions in the Sudan. HSBC and NatWest have been fined hundreds of millions of pounds for allowing criminals and Mexican drug cartels to launder their money through accounts held at their banks. Around £5 billion of taxpayers' money, as an estimate, in the form of bounce-back loans has been taken fraudulently because some banks have not applied the most basic of checks. Exactly. Criminals, despots and terrorists involved in people trafficking, illegal immigration, drug dealing, extortion, kleptocracy, the impoverishment of nations and fraud, including directly from the public purse to the tune of £30 billion per annum, are all facilitated by some of the lax rules we have in this country. The Government has promised to tackle this by means of Companies House reform, as my honourable friend says, to fund regulation by applying a small surcharge to the current cost of establishing a company in the UK, so we can close down those shell companies and trusts. To introduce a register of overseas entities to reveal the real beneficial owners of UK property. And a corporate offence of failing to prevent economic crime, so, for example, banks can be properly held to account for granting those fraudulent bounce-back loans. All this, plus more resources for our agencies and new whistleblower protections, will boost this country's reputation, tackle crime and help to lower our tax burden. Every minister I've spoken wants to do this. The Treasury Select Committee wants to do this. All our crime agencies want to do this. Campaigners want to do this. I urge the Government to bring forward this legislation as soon as possible.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all acknowledge the work of my honourable friend, the member for Thursk and Moulton, in this area, both on Companies House reform, both on whistleblowing as well, and general economic crime. He really has a handle on this issue, and his words are always well received, his thoughts are well received. He's absolutely right that economic crimes are a significant cost to the economy, and he's detailed that. And the victims, remember there are victims at the end of this as well, they experience significant distress. We also recognise the national security implications of allowing dirty money from overseas into our financial system. We acknowledge the need for action on economic crime, and this government has acted. My colleagues in the Home Office and Treasury have commenced reforms to the suspicious activity reporting regime, created the National Economic Crime Centre to coordinate the law enforcement response, reviewed our money laundering regulations and supervisory regime, which will report by June 2022, and we are legislating for the economic crime levy in the current finance bill. We're committed to building a framework which will deter such crimes from happening and provide a framework which ensures that those who commit such crimes can be held to account.
Come to Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for his urgent question today. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was widespread recognition of the urgent need to get money out to support businesses as soon as possible. But what made Lord Agnew's resignation statement this week so alarming was his criticism of how the government is handling cases of fraud now we know about them, and this news that the government may no longer be intending to bring forward the economic crime bill. Lord Agnew described the performance of the Department for Business as nothing less than woeful, and added that they are ably assisted by the Treasury, who appear to have no knowledge or interest in the consequences of fraud to our economy or society. To be honest, Mr. Speaker, it's one of the few times in this Parliament the two departments have been consistent with each other. But these are very serious allegations for a serving minister to make. And I'm worried by what the Minister has just had to say about the economic crime bill. So let me ask him about the government's intentions in this area and whether its commitments still apply. Firstly, is it still government policy to legislate for a register of beneficial ownership of property in the UK so we can find out who really owns property in this country? Secondly, will the government still legislate to prevent abuses of Scottish limited partnerships? Thirdly, will the government still legislate to prevent the shortcomings in the unexplained wealth order regime highlighted by the recent case in the High Court of Baker and others? Fourthly, will the government still reform Companies House? Quite obviously, if the register of British companies was more rigorously checked and policed, there would not have been as many fraudulent companies as they were to engage in fraud when this crisis began. Finally, can the Minister confirm that his department's latest estimate of the value of fraudulent bounce-back loans is £4.9 billion, and it is their intention to write off £4.3 billion of that? Mr. Speaker, this sorry episode reveals a government far too casual with wasting taxpayers' money. But there is also an aspect to economic crime which relates to the probity and integrity of our financial and political systems. And I hope the Minister can provide me and this House with some much-needed reassurance today.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and indeed our appetite for tackling economic crime remains undiminished, and indeed as it does with Companies House reform as well, which has been well trailed and well considered, and we will continue to work in this area. But what I can't do is preempt what Her Majesty will say in the Queen's speech. In terms of the bounce-back loans that he talked about, the Economic Secretary made really clear in this House HMRC did not produce the figure of £4.3 billion, and the money has not been written off. It was an inference, I think, by journalists who subtracted £1.5 billion, the estimate of the amount to be recovered by the taxpayer protection from the £5.8 billion that was estimated as error and fraud in 2021. 2020 to 2021. It was publicised before Christmas. We continue to work with our department, with our fraud measures and partners in government, with the British Business Bank and indeed all the partner banks who issued this money in the first place.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that the Minister can't be tempted to comment on what might or might not be in the Queen's speech, but based on what Lord Agnew has said, if it were to be true, can I please urge him to consider that it will be about as popular as a cup of cold sick with anybody out there who is concerned about the fight against corruption or the fight for transparency. The well of excuses after 3 or 4 years of promising this piece of legislation or its related pieces has now run dry, and it is absolutely essential for the credibility of this country and of this government, particularly at a time when we have a crisis in Ukraine and all sorts of Russian oligarchs waiting to move money into this country if they possibly can. And there are questions, we just heard in Prime Minister's questions, about fundamental questions of integrity about Westminster here today. It is absolutely essential that we do not back away from this central piece of legislation, which is a touchstone issue for many, many stakeholders out there.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I appreciate his work in tackling corruption and encouraging further transparency as well, which we have several conversations about. But look, we remain undiminished in our approach to tackling economic crime for the reasons that he's given, and indeed Companies House reform as well. We will work with Home Office, we will work with Treasury to make sure that we can get these in place as soon as possible.
MSP spokesperson Alison Thulis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lamentable, woeful, arrogance, indolence and ignorance were just some of the words Lord Agnew described this government's action on economic crime as. And by resigning at the dispatch box in the Lords, he's shown a lot more courage than anybody in the front benches in this place. 4.3 billion lost in the COVID schemes, as yet unknown sums lost in government-backed loan schemes to crooks and fraudsters, while some in this country got no support whatsoever. And it was deemed too difficult to redress support for in the schemes for parents, for example, in the CEAST scheme. And Lord Agnew also said it was a foolish decision to kill off the Economic Crime Bill. And with the evidence I've heard at Treasury Select Committee in our inquiry on this, I would absolutely and wholeheartedly agree. And economic crime could be halted in many cases had the government tightened up Companies House, because reform is well overdue. The government has huge volumes of evidence on this. There is no verification. There is a tiny sum to set up a company, and the information in Companies House on the register is, calling it politely, utter guff. And if the Minister looks at Graham Barrow on Twitter, he will see some of the absolute nonsense that is entered into the Companies House register and yet somehow accepted. All of which, Mr. Speaker, has led to an open door through which crooks and fraudsters have been allowed to waltz off with public money and government-backed loans. And UK corporate structures, such as SLPs, are allowing this to happen and have done for years. So what date will we see an economic crime bill? On what date will we see the registration of overseas entities bill, which I sat on the joint committee with the Lords on years ago, and the government has failed to act? And why is it that this government is so unconcerned at the UK being deemed Londongrad, notorious for the laundering of dirty money? And who benefits from this, Mr. Speaker? Is it Tory donors and their pals?
I think that last comment is beneath the debate, and because she talks about Companies House reform, and clearly there's a lot of work already happening in Companies House. It already supports law enforcement on hundreds of cases each month. We want to get the balance right between making sure that Companies House, that new entrepreneurs can set up businesses easily and affordable, but we know there's so much more to be done in reform. And this is why, as I say, our appetite remains undiminished. She talked about Lord Agnew. Can I thank Lord Agnew for the work that he's done in this area? I've worked with him closely in tackling and putting measures in place to tackle fraud in bounce-back loans in particular, and other areas of government. He's been a great servant for this government, and I regret the fact that he's gone.
Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate my honourable friend on raising this matter and point out to the Minister that the government over the last 10 years has made a lot of progress in this area, but that working across the House, many members have put a lot of time and effort into trying to advance what is an important British agenda, not least at the G8 under David Cameron's leadership. Can I point out to him that the Companies House remains a very good library, but it doesn't have investigatory powers, and it is there that we want to see progress made. And will he agree to meet with my honourable friend and myself and others who are particularly concerned about progress in that area, together with those who run Companies House, to see whether we can make some progress together?
I thank my right honourable friend. He raises some very interesting points and important points. And I'm sure if I'll ask the relevant minister, more likely Lord Canelan in the other place, to meet with him. But I'm happy to meet with him in either way.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, but the minister's a nice chap. But we've been calling for this for ages and ages and ages, and ministers come back to the House time after time to say, yes, there's going to be a public register of beneficial ownership. It still hasn't happened. They say they're going to do it in the overseas territory. It still hasn't happened. They say they're going to stop giving out golden visas to Russians with dodgy money coming into the UK. It still hasn't happened. We are a soft touch in this country. If we want to give a strong message to Russia, in particular at this moment, we've got to move swiftly, not say, oh, I can't possibly comment on what legislation we might be thinking of in the future.
I thank my honourable friend, and it's a shame he didn't stop at the first sentence there, but he's very, very kind of him. But look, I appreciate all of those measures that he wants to put in place, and as I say, we remain undiminished in that. In the meantime, we have sanctions on corruption, tackling corruption from other countries, and we already have very robust procedures in place, but we know we need to go further, and that's why these measures will come, but I cannot preempt Her Majesty.
Sir Robert Butland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with remarks of praise for my noble friend Lord Agnew, who was an outstanding minister who asked searching questions of government at all times. It was a pleasure to work with him. Can I press my honourable friend about the work in particular that the Law Commission is undertaking on corporate criminal liability? They are due to present options early this year, and I would urge him, first of all, to use all expedition to get on with the job of legislating on economic crime, and secondly, to incorporate what I hope will be sensible recommendations to the Law Commission so that we can get corporate criminal liability in this country right. At the moment, the law is just not working and action is needed.
I thank my right honourable friend. Can I thank him for his work in this area as well? And indeed, because there's been no consensus, it's important that the Law Commission looks at this, because this is a very technical crime. If we're going to get the answers to this right, we've got to get it right first time. And yes, absolutely, we will consider that report in its fullest when it comes to it.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I firstly want to congratulate the member on bringing this urgent question, also to thank him for backing my bill, which would have brought in that register of beneficial interest. When I mentioned this to the Prime Minister just this week, he pointed to the Leader of the House and said it would be introduced as soon as possible. And now look what's happened. The vehicle that we would have used to do that is gone. So I asked the Minister, how can he say that he is taking this seriously? But this government says one thing and does the complete opposite, does it not?
I'm afraid the honourable lady is preempting the Queen's speech, Her Majesty, who will present this. There has been nothing pulled at all. Her Majesty will set out the government's programme in due course.
Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my honourable friend for securing this really important urgent question. The National Crime Agency, using figures supplied by the National Fraud Indicator, estimate that up to £190 billion are lost to fraud, with 140 of it coming from private sector and 40 billion coming from the public sector. This is a huge amount which could be best invested in our economies. Yeah. Would you agree with me that we need to reward and protect those whistleblowers who are at the forefront of this, the informed insiders who bring these issues to light, with more than 40% of this crime being uncovered by whistleblowers, and that the current legislation, PIDA, is not fit for purpose and needs to be looked at again with an office of the whistleblower that would actually bring together all of these areas?
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend, and again congratulate her and thank her for the work that she does in this area. Whereas we have had a number of conversations, and we'll always look to see what more we can do to strengthen the whistleblowing framework and legislation. We don't necessarily always agree on the end result, but again, it's a complicated area that we do want to get it right for the reasons that she said, and I'll continue to work with her and my honourable friend, the member for Thurston Moulton. On
Dame Angela Regal.
Whilst the Minister wrings his hands, London has become the jurisdiction of choice for dirty money. The levels of fraud are soaring upwards in the wrong direction, and we've waited years and years for the open register of beneficial ownership of companies, and it hasn't appeared. We've waited years and years for corporate liability reform. How much longer do we have to wait? And how much worse is this government going to let fraud and money laundering get before they get off their collective backside and do something?
Yeah. What I'm not going to do, Mr. Speaker, is preempt Her Majesty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with those remarks already made in praise of Lord Agnew, who's done did great service in government. Will the Minister ensure that at the same time as he develops this policy, we ensure the UK is also home to new innovations like fintech, like the extraordinary growth of cryptocurrencies? These innovations have the potential to disrupt finance, just as social media has disrupted communications or online shopping has changed retail. And post-Brexit, the UK has the chance to be the home of fintech, which can not only be an economic driver, but also help to cut fraud and financial crime because of the transparency that it brings. So will you make sure that we get this right and make sure new legislation is fit for the future so Britain can be home of this revolution?
That's my right honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. That's why we've got to get this legislation right, because what we don't want to do, we want to tackle economic crime. What we don't want to do is stifle innovation. We don't want to stifle investment in this country, which makes us the highest for foreign direct investment in the EU and in Europe, and one of the highest indeed across the world. Because this is a great place to do business, to set up, grow and scale companies.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the whole House would love to believe the words which the Minister is saying here today, and certainly I know in Northern Ireland, where paramilitary money has been turned into a vast empire along the border especially, economic crime is rife. But the evidence isn't great, Minister. The casual writing off of £4.3 billion worth of bounce-back loans, the fact that Companies House is in such chaos that people can avoid paying money out on debts by going bankrupt one day and starting a company the next day. The fact that in the middle of the Ukraine crisis we threaten to take sanctions on Russia, and yet we are not taking immediate action against the dirty money from Russia which flows into to London and props up the Putin regime. And indeed, the fact that the fraud minister himself has said this week the Treasury has little interest or little knowledge of fraud. The evidence isn't great, Minister, when we get assurances that the government is serious about tackling fraud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, first of all, as I've said earlier, the £4.3 billion that was cited is an inference by journalists. That money is not being written off by this government, and we're working with partners to ensure that we can tackle the fraud that is clearly within the system, having given money out at such a crucial stage of the pandemic to allow businesses to survive. In terms of the Phoenix companies that we were talking about, that's exactly why we introduced the Directors' Disqualification Bill, so that we can reopen businesses and therefore tackle directors. But there's clearly more that we need to do, and again, we will do that when parliamentary time allows.
Arabelle.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my honourable friend on this question, endorse everything he asked for. I know the Minister cannot anticipate the Queen's speech, but could I ask that he looks at the debate we had in this House on lawfare last Thursday, which was responded to by the right honourable friend, the member for South Suffolk, and look at the fact that right now in our courts, cases that are being investigated, litigants are outgunning the Serious Fraud Office. Litigants for oligarchs are basically conducting lawfare and judicial review against our regulators and preventing these cases from being prosecuted properly. So will he speak with our right honourable friend, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Justice, and make sure any future legislation takes into account the threat of lawfare as well?
I thank my honourable friend. The lawfare debate was incredibly interesting, incredibly enlightening, and absolutely we will make sure that we work together across government to take all of these matters into consideration in future legislation.
O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The former Minister, Lord Agnew, said fraud in government is rampant. Public estimates are something like £30 billion a year. There's a complete lack of focus on the cost to society or indeed the taxpayer. And what we've heard so far from the Minister is complacency. We need action now, because fraudulent crime and money laundering is financing organised crime, drug trafficking, prostitution and much of society's ills. The Minister needs to step up and get on with the job, legislate and go after the fraudsters who've stolen taxpayers' money.
She's absolutely right in terms of actually tackling fraudsters, and that's why we remain undiminished in bringing forward measures in legislation in this area. At the other end of the scale, but which adds up to a lot of money, universal credit in itself was a measure, an anti-fraud measure, as well as being more responsive to benefit claimants in itself. One of the great things about Lord Agnew was his attention to detail, attention to the small acts, which can have big implications as well, which will widely missed, but we will bring that learning into across government.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department uses the National Investigation Service for Fraud with frauds over 100,000. Now, the NAO has reported that they had 2,100 intelligence reports in the last year. Only 50 were investigated. The NAO has identified this is a lack of capacity. So rather than wait for the Queen's speech, why don't you speak to the Chancellor and ask for some extra funding for the service to pursue those frauds?
We've invested in a number of schemes, including the National Investigation Service, as well, to boost their capacity to investigate cases of serious fraud, especially within the Bounce Back Loan scheme at the moment. They've received £5 million in the 2020 spending review. They've made recoveries worth £3.1 million in 2021-2022, exceeding their targets. But they've got investigations into bounce back loan frauds and other areas, and we will continue to work with them in this area.
Mark Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Minister will agree with that my constituents have the right to expect that victims of economic crime get the same redress as other crimes, including where the victims are taxpayers. And I know he will also welcome the many comments that I had from businesses in my constituency about the speed of support that was made available to prevent failures. But in respect of the government-backed loans during the pandemic, does he think it would be helpful for the British Business Bank to be required to release performance data of the lenders to provide the transparency of banks' activities during this time?
I thank my honourable friend for all his work throughout the pandemic and his position as a select committee member, and he's been asking probing questions, and indeed within the British Business Bank we've tried to get the balance right between the transparency that is required so we can tackle this and the speed of being able to act as well, so we're not consuming too much of their resources in this area. It's early days in terms of fraud and recovery, but yes, data will become available.
Mr. Bradshaw.
How can he reassure us, though, that one of the reasons for the government's reluctance to act on this is, as highlighted in the Intelligence and Security Committee's report on Russian interference in our democracy, the large amounts of Russian and other dirty money that flow into Conservative Party coffers?
Well, I've come back to there is no reluctance to act. What I can't do is preempt Her Majesty. Our appetite, as I say, remains undiminished. It's just a shame that the honourable gentleman hides behind Intelligence and Security Committee papers to throw political accusations, when what we're trying to do is to make sure that taxpayers of this country get value for money, they're not losing money, the victims of economic crime are reduced and get their recovery back. Let's not make it a party political issue.
Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree with the recommendation of the Joint Select Committee on the Draft Online Safety Bill that online platforms like Facebook should not be allowed to profit from the advertising of known frauds and scams, and they should be required, as part of the online safety regime, to proactively block and withdraw advertising that promotes known frauds and scams?
We're really aware of the issues and appreciate the comments in that report, and obviously as that bill has its process, we'll consider that in all full due process.
Stephen Timmins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The introduction of universal credit has led to a big increase in fraud. The current growth of economic crime and corruption pose an existential threat to financial services, one of our biggest and most successful business sectors, and therefore to the UK economy as a whole. Does the Minister accept that tackling effectively this scourge does require urgently an economic crime bill?
Well, I would dispute his comments about universal credit, but yes, tackling economic crime does require legislation. And that's why we remain undiminished in pushing this forward.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has very eloquently described the reason and priority to bring forward new legislation, but that opens the door to the effectiveness of and the force with which existing legislation will be brought to bear on the key issue raised by Lord Agnew, which was about fraud within the the BBLs and CBL schemes during COVID. So can my right honourable friend tell me, we know from Lord Agnew that there were issues with fraudsters through processes in the British Business Bank that were not up to scratch. We know from Lord Agnew that it was some banks, maybe 2 out of 7, where there was a priority of fraud. Can my honourable friend tell me, he has a choice to make, is he going to come down on these fraudsters with a slap on the wrist or with a mighty hammer? I know which I would choose. What is the Minister going to do?
I suspect we have the same choice, frankly, with that mighty hammer. But what we've got to do, first of all, is make sure that we have those processes in place. The British Business Bank obviously had to scale up very, very quickly in the pandemic, but we are working with them and with the banks who are first port of call in this, with it being a delegated scheme. But we want to make sure that those banks, the worst performing banks, actually scale up to the best performing banks in tackling this, and we will continue to work to that endeavour.
And this Lawton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The lawfare debate, which the Minister described as interesting, identified how money launderers use UK courts to cover up unlawful activity. Plus, yes, that's a slightly underestimate the term that he's used. But the Minister, responding to that debate, said, and I quote, "The government is poised to act." Well, given that they've abandoned their economic crime bill, given the Attorney General is investigating a malpractice at the Serious Fraud Office, which she is supposed to supervise, and given too much oligarch money does flow into the Tory party, how poised are they?
Very.
Gazelle-like.
Mr. Minister, just how bad level economic crime has to be before the government brings this bill forward. But could you also perhaps just set out to the House how well worked up legislation is for many of the proposals that have been promised for years and years? And I think he'll find there's quite a lot of support across the House to bring those measures forward piecemeal. We've still got 3 months of this session. Why wait for the Queen? Let's bring some forward and get on with them.
Well, I would agree with my honourable friend that we want to get this right, that it is a technical issue, it is a complex issue, and we'll continue to work with people that are experts in their field, knowledgeable in this field, to make sure that we can get that legislation totally in place, that we can push it through in good time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware, and certainly his Treasury colleagues are aware, of the activities of Patrick McCreish and Philip Nunn of Blackmore Bond Notoriety. Nearly 5 years after their dodgy and probably illegal sales tactics were first brought to the attention of regulators, these two are still allowed to continue in operation at the helm of a veritable spider's web of companies, collecting scores of yellow cards and some red cards for breaches of statutory obligations, but subject to no personal sanction other than the occasional closure of one of the companies that they wanted to close down anyway. So how much longer are we supposed to be satisfied with a regulator that in one case accepted the registration of a 10-year-old as a company officer? And when we go and have a regulator with teeth to drag dodgy directors out from hiding behind company nameplates to be held personally responsible in a way that correctly reflects the fortunes that they have made and the financial misery they have inflicted on their victims?
I know the honourable gentleman has used that example on a number of occasions and raised that particularly pertinent example, may I say. But as I say, Companies House reform is something that is at the foremost of our priorities, and it will come as soon as parliamentary time allows.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I congratulate my honourable friend on securing this urgent question. From migrant boats to county lines, the golden thread that runs between them is illicit money flows. And whilst the National Cybersecurity Strategy and the Economic Crime Plan and the measures in them are welcome, what we really need is a bill to bring this forward. So could I urge my honourable friend to use his good offices to make that case, not just to deal with some of these big issues, but also the low-level frauds which are affecting so many of our constituents, and which, let's not forget, is the #1 crime in this country at the moment.
I thank my honourable friend for his work in this area and those comments, because he's absolutely right. The theme in this is crime. It says economic crime. We're talking about crime in county lines and these kind of things, and that's why our work, the business department with Treasury and with Home Office working together, we can get this right to tackle all of that in the round.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, fraud is a traumatic experience which makes reports that victims are having their details collated and sold on the dark web as a part of some called suckers list extremely worrying. So what can be done to protect victims from being targeted a second time, and will you ensure that this is a particular focus of the government's work moving forward?
I thank the honourable gentleman, and indeed, first of all, in terms of awareness, we need to do lots of work on awareness in scams and these kind of areas, which does fall into my direct remit. But afterwards, as well, Action Fraud is taking more and more of a position here to actually support victims, and then to, again, as he rightly says, tackle the immediacy after the event and make sure it can't happen again.
Mike Wonder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cyber criminals prey on vulnerable people in all of our communities. Yesterday's launch of the very first cybersecurity strategy was an important step forward. But will my honourable friend, the Minister, continue to work with ministers on further measures that will strengthen the UK's resistance to cyber fraud?
I thank my honourable friend's welcome for the government's cyber strategy. He's absolutely right to highlight the importance of this area and how we are tackling that in government. We'll continue to do more as time allows, as we get more and more information. This legislation needs to be right for the 21st century. It needs to keep up with these areas that criminals are using in cyber and dark web and these kind of areas.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers so far? But after the recent resignation of Lord Agnew, following a lack of consideration for an economic crime bill in the mandate, there have been many calls for this decision to be reconsidered or reviewed. This bill was set to protect and better manage the UK's economic prosperity. Can I remind the Minister very gently of the £10.6 million robbery of the Northern Bank in Northern Ireland by the IRA? Experts state that the monies have been laundered through legitimate businesses. Alongside that, you have a fuel duty of £396 million that's been lost to the Chancellor as well. So through this economic crime bill, we could address the issues of the IRA and their illegal activities and murderous activities. And would the Minister confirm to us today in this House that every action will be done to make sure this comes in as soon as possible to take on those who live off the backs of others?
I thank my honourable gentleman, the honourable member, as ever, and he raises a really good point that not all economic crime is international. There's a lot of homegrown economic crime, and he's cited just one of a number that's happening in Northern Ireland and indeed across the UK. And yes, we will make sure that we can bring these measures to this place to be scrutinised and pushed through as soon as possible.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fraudsters, criminals and bad people take advantage of measures introduced in response to crises, whether financial or otherwise. This is an incredibly complex area. Every member of this House will have had constituents who will have lost out one way or another through fraud over the years. So it's a matter, I hope, that the Minister will take the sentiments from across the House. I think every party in the House has spoken today concerned about this issue and the delay that's come about. Could I urge him to take two things into account? He's learning lessons. Can he learn the lessons from the response to the financial crisis when our banks introduced measures which led to virtual confiscation of over, for example, 16,000 customers from the global restructuring group within RBS? And can he please learn lessons that can try to ensure proper corporate behaviour by lenders. And secondly, he's mentioned action fraud. The threshold under which action fraud will investigate or urge the police to investigate in various forces is incredibly high. And as a consequence, while we all urge our constituents to make contact with action fraud, invariably nothing follows.
Yeah. That is true.
I don't think, honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. We recognise those constraints, and that's why we're looking at replacing action fraud with a new organisation based on with the City of London Police to try and tackle the areas that he raises. We will also clearly learn the lessons, and he's absolutely right, because we want to get the balance right. That we're confiscating the right amount of money from the right amount of people, from the right people, the criminals.